here. I want to show something that came in the mail this week because it's really super cool. And that is this helmet right here. So there we go. Anyone recognize that helmet design in general? I guess I'll put it on. I really probably shouldn't because I don't know whose head was in this thing last. So anybody recognize the shape of the design? Yes, that's the Soviet helmet. It's a Russian. It's a Soviet helmet. And actually, the Soviet helmet has some history to it. So it came in the mail. And the person that sent it to me collected this in 1991 in Iraq. So the story is that he was serving with a special unit of the U.S. Army that was part of the Historic Command, the History Command. And their job was to collect war artifacts to be used in U.S. museums from the Gulf War in 1991. And the story is that they had found a supply depot. They'd sent someone to go check what was in the supply depot. They came back with a number of uniforms and items. And one of the things that they came from here that he gave to him was this particular helmet. Okay, so someone says World War II, and actually that's a start to it. So this is the Russian design. And actually from World War II on. So the first time that you would have had a shell of this rough design, we'll figure out exactly what this one is in a little bit, but first time you would have had a shell of this rough design was the SSH, which means steel helmet 1939, which was worn by the Soviet troops in 1939 is the model, and then the SSH Model 40. Those would have been worn throughout the Second World War, but it wouldn't be surprising to have an SS 39 or 40 wind up in Iraq in 1991 because there were millions of them were made, and then they were sent all over the world after the war. But they also had the Model 60 and the Model 69. When this was sent on the letter, it said that this was an SSH 69, but that's really just a generic term. I mean, it was the most common kind of helmet that would have been hanging around the Middle East at the time. Those are years. So the Model 60 and the Model 69 were put out in 1960 and 1969, and those could have been shipped all over the world. And so it certainly could be a Soviet SS 69, but so you have to figure out, is this if this is the Soviet helmet, is this the 39, the 40, the 60, the 69? They look very, very similar. You have to look at various things to figure that out. But there's a broader story than that, because these were used all over the Warsaw Pact, and they were produced throughout the Warsaw Pact. And particularly they were made by Hungary, by Czechoslovakia, and by Poland for export. And so it could also be, among all those Soviet models, it could be different models of helmets that were made by other Soviet satellite states that also easily could have wound up in the Middle East. But what's important from it, though, is that it was found in an Iraqi depot in 1991. It means it's not a battlefield find. Now, there is some criticism over battlefield finds. If you go out and find stuff laying on the battlefield, then you might be messing with a war grave. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, it's a controversy. I'm not sure. I mean, if this was some Iraqi who had bid it in the first Gulf War, he didn't need his hat anymore. But still, other people might complain, say we shouldn't be taking hats off of dead people, that's a war grave. This was not a war found item. It was actually found. It was found during a war, but it was actually found out of a depot, which suggests that it didn't have some poor Iraqi guy shot out from under it in a war where they were wildly outmatched. But it is got quite a lot of use to it, and we'll be able to find out some more things about this helmet. So the next question is really exactly what kind of helmet is it, because it is based on that original Soviet SSH 39 model, but there were a lot of those different models, and they can mean a lot of different things. So there's a lot of things to look at. There's some things in the shape, but the first place that you're going to look is the liner. This liner, if you're familiar with World War II helmets, this is the liner that you would have found on a Stahlhelm, on a German Stahlhelm. Doesn't look much like the liner that was inside a Soviet helmet, an SS-39 or anything else. And actually, this is not based on the Stahlhelm. This is based on the Italian Model 33 helmet, which used a very similar design to the Stahlhelm. It's called an 8. It's got eight pieces in here, so that's called an 8-piece liner. And so that actually narrows this down quite a lot. This is not a Soviet helmet. They didn't use that liner. And the first thing that brings to mind, if you see that 8-piece liner inside this kind of shell, is that this is probably a Czech Model 53. Those were sent throughout the world. You found them in the Indo-Pakistani War. You find them throughout Africa. You find them much in the Middle East. They were sold for export, a lot of them. The problem with that is, if this was a Czech helmet, then it should have under the, make sure I have the front here, you should have a very clear stamp with a picture of cross swords and a date on it that would indicate that it was approved. But I don't know why you got the stamp of quality from a Czechoslovakian knockoff of a Russian helmet, but they all would have that, and it's missing that. And that suggests, and actually that leaves it down to what this really is, this helmet is, when you figure it out. There's actually only a couple of helmets that use this kind of liner without that stamp on it. That makes it clear that this is a Polish model and it was called the not M50. It was called the P. Let me make sure I get the number right here. Just by the lettering. The WZ, yes, the Polish WZ50. This is a Polish model. So what happened is this was made in Poland as a knockoff helmet of the Soviet helmets. And actually, you can really tell that because if you see here, this flange is a lot wider on the Polish helmet, and that's one of the ways that you could tell. Probably could have told it from the shape, but actually the liner narrows it down really quickly. But the liner narrows it down a little bit more too, because you can see how it's affixed here, and there's stitching here. The earlier Polish ones, that would have been riveted. So this was made after 1956. It was made in Poland. But if it was Polish, it should in the middle of the thing here have a stamp with a maker and a date on it. It doesn't. That doesn't concern me because it was probably just made for export, and they didn't bother stamping ones that are made for export. So that tells us some things about this helmet. It was made in Poland after 1956. It wound up in the Middle East. It could have been sold directly to Iraq, but it easily could have been sold to another Arab country like Egypt, which bought a lot of these because these kinds of items were traded quite a lot around the Middle East at the time. And we know that it couldn't have been used in the Iraq War because it was in American hands by 1991. But we also know it wasn't used in the Gulf War because it was found in a depot, not on somebody's head. But you can see a lot of use to it. But with something else we can see, and it's kind of hard to see with the lighting in here, but this is a really weird color. It's a dark green, but it's not like a drab green. It's actually this kind of weird turquoisey green. And that actually, it's very clear where this came from and when these were used. This is almost certainly used in the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. Somehow this found its way to Iraq prior to 1988. And was almost certainly used in that war just by the color that's painted on it and the fact that it clearly has wear on it that looks like it's been fairly carefully used. So that's a lot to know about a helmet just looking at the external characteristics. That this was made in Poland sometimes after 1956, on its way to Iraq before 1988, served in the Iran-Iraq War, was put into a depot, found by an American in 1991, and then ended up with me just this last year. I've been sitting with that American since 1991. It was not so nice of him to send it here. And so that's a lot of interesting story, right? Almost looks like British racing green. Yeah, I don't even know if there's a name for the color, but that color was actually what was commonly used by the Iraqis during the Iran-Iraq War. Though it's possible this could have been captured from an Iranian because they use these too. I'm told that you can find these things laying all over the desert if you're along the border there, but this one had been collected up into a depot and apparently not gone on somebody's head during the Gulf War, even though these kinds of helmets were typically being used during the Gulf War. There is one other thing that I can figure out looking at it, by the way, is that these rivets here, you see this bright steel rivet here? Actually, the rivets were very small. So these rivets, the placing on them makes it pretty clear that this is a Polish helmet too, a WZ50, but the size of the rivets is wrong, and that means that this was refurbished at some point and cheaper rivets were used. So there's no hole in it. So apparently that didn't cost anybody anything, but it appears to have been refurbished because those would be the original rivets that came on it. And that's kind of cool with a little bit of research, which you can find out about stuff that you find. And it's a cool story that this probably served in the Iran-Iraq War, was captured by an American during the Gulf War, and then sent to me. And now it's on my desk, and I will probably have a video out on that type of helmet at some point. Wasn't that fun? That's the sort of stuff that comes into my house on a regular week. So what are we, 6:14? Let's see what we got. I knew you would figure it out. Larry, is that you? Yeah, that's Larry sent it to me. Larry's on here. Hey, thank you. Larry, he's actually on the guy who sent me the helmet is on here. Larry, thank you for your service. And thank you very much for sending me the helmet. And yes, I was able to figure out. It was a little bit of a mystery at first because I thought for sure it was a Czech helmet, but I could not find the right stamp on it. But it was pretty clearly not a Soviet helmet from the start because those liners were used on a couple of helmets. It's kind of funny that they're using a liner that was exactly what the Germans used in the Second World War, but actually it's not. Even though it's using that leather pattern, it's really special. I don't know if you can see it in here. These Polish helmets are actually kind of special. And if you can see, I don't know if I can show it in here, but where it fixes, it's actually on a little post. So it doesn't affix directly to the bracket on the helmet. It's affixing to a metal post that affixes to the bracket. That makes it a bit of a floating liner, which means that it absorbs impact, kind of like the liners in the American helmets, which was actually kind of cool. The Polish, it was one of the first ones to have that kind of liner in it. And it does also distinguish it. I probably could have figured out that it was Polish just because the way that it's seated in there is different than it's seated on the Czech helmet. But the thing is, guys wearing these helmets, they all look alike. And they might have the same ballistic protection. It's really hard to find because they were made in the old Soviet Union and the records aren't necessarily all around. It's really hard to find like what metal they were made out of. I'm told that the Polish ones weigh a little bit more than the Soviet ones, and so it might actually have a different metal content. But I couldn't find a reference anywhere that made it clear what the content was for the Polish helmets. Know exactly how many were made. What we know is the Poles made a whole lot of those. They made them for the export market. They sold them all throughout the Middle East, and it's not at all a surprise that wound up in Iraq in 1991 for Larry's friend to find it and then give it to Larry, who then sent it to me, and thank you very much. Let's see, a little late, risotto can't be rushed.